Final Fantasy XVI is the newest in the franchise and getting high critic praise across the board. It is a fantastic game, but as a long-term Final Fantasy fan, for me personally there are a few shortcomings from a JRPG perspective that prevents the game from reaching masterpiece heights of the series. Like most new entries in the series, 16 has made a number of changes to the formula to attract a new fanbase. Labeling itself as an action RPG, the combat has drawn a lot of inspiration from Devil May Cry, which shouldn't be surprising seeing that the lead combat director previously worked on Devil May Cry 5. As a result of this, the game has stripped away a lot of the traditional RPG elements, both inside and outside of combat. Whilst the changes have attracted a lot of new fans to the series due to its more streamlined approach, for me personally this entry has removed a lot of elements that I have enjoyed throughout the series' 35-year history. Final Fantasy has long been associated as the godfather of JRPGs, and the series is the primary reason I fell in love with the genre. Whilst I really enjoyed the game for what it was, during my playthrough it had me thinking what I would change about the game to make it a stronger RPG. So here are 5 things that I believe would make Final Fantasy XVI a stronger RPG. The combat of Final Fantasy XVI has probably taken the most dramatic shift of the series to date, leaning into a more action-focused over a more traditional RPG experience. Though the series has dabbled in action combat in its more recent entries in Final Fantasy XV and Final Fantasy VII Remake, Final Fantasy XVI has streamlined the combat in a way that has removed a lot of the RPG elements. As a part of this shift, elemental and status effects have been removed from combat. Magic has also taken a reduced role, in which previous entries had always played a key role in turning the tides of battle, either through elemental advantages or buffs. Magic in Final Fantasy XVI is limited to short or charge bursts, with no enemies having any elemental weaknesses.
It still feels odd to me hitting a bomb with a fire-based attack and seeing damage counters.
I am invincible! Invincible! Ow!
Buff and debuff spells such as Protect and Silence have also been removed from the party's arsenal. I was a little puzzled as some enemy varieties in the game have access to spells like Protect that weren't available at a party level. With each icon having their own elemental affinity, it could have added an extra strategic layer to the game by having elemental strengths and weaknesses tied to the abilities and magic of each icon,
Forcing you to switch icons on the fly to expose enemy weaknesses or prevent your own.
Also, adding additional buff and debuff spells tied to these elements would have added extra depth to the combat. Throughout the game, you'll have a number of characters accompanying you on the journey, but sadly they have no ability to be commanded or influenced by your actions. The closest we got to a controllable character is Clive's faithful doggo companion Torgal. Torgal is able to be called upon on a very low cooldown for one of 3 actions, and is very useful in extending combos. In addition to Torgal, we also see Cid, Jill, and various other major characters accompanying Clive in good portions of the story, but sadly were not able to be controlled.
Spring forth, burly protector, and save me! Ah, jeez. I never hang out with him, normally.
We were given a tease through Joshua in the early stage of the game, hinting that there would be potentially other characters able to be controlled. However, sadly this didn't pan out, and we were locked to Clive for the entirety of the game. And what is an added sting is that both Torgal and the others don't have any ability or stat-based leveling, and don't have any customizable equipment, which just limits the personal input on the growth of these characters. The accompanying characters also don't have any risk from a combat perspective,
Seemingly being unable to be knocked out compared to previous entries.
Whilst Final Fantasy XV was also similar in this regard, you were still able to influence your party members' equipment, ability development, and were able to execute moves at particular times as well. You also had to ensure that their HP and MP did not drop too low, which added to the party experience. We have also come off the incredibly versatile action combat system of Final Fantasy VII Remake, where you controlled a single character but were able to switch to another on the fly for a completely unique combat experience. Whilst Clive is a very versatile character, he is primarily very melee focused. As someone who's really enjoyed the Final Fantasy series from being able to experiment with different characters and classes, it's a bit of an omission that we only had a singular type of character class to control. It would have been a great addition to be able to switch control to one of the other characters, to potentially also give us a unique combat experience of having different combat styles. For example, we could have had Jill being in a more magic or support role, and Cid in a more technical rogue standpoint. The side quests for me are the personal lowlight of the game. A lot of them were very MMO influenced, with a large majority of them being item fetch quests or go and defeat X creature in X location. The dialogue exchanges in these quests also rarely had any narrative weight compared to the main story in a jarring sense, and they seem to be added to the game purely just to pad out the length. A friend of mine on Instagram, Pause Gamer, put it perfectly: you go from defeating gods to delivering milk.
Could I trouble you for a glass of warm milk? It helps put me to sleep.
You could trouble me for a warm glass of shut the hell up.
There is the odd side quest that does have a good narrative payoff, but they were few and far between, and seems like they really opted for more quantity over quality. I found myself halfway through the game skipping over dialogue quite frequently, and towards the end game I ended up skipping side quests altogether unless they had a plus sign on them.
I don't plan on making a habit of this. I'm busy enough as it is.
The rewards for the majority of the side quests were also rarely worth the trade-off. Quite frequently you'd be rewarded with a crafting material that was already quite plentiful in your inventory, either through the story or combat. While I do appreciate that these are optional, side quests and previous entries, while not perfect across the board, had an enjoyable narrative weights or had great item payoffs that made these really feel worth it. If they would have potentially halved the amount of side quests and fleshed these out a bit more, or adjusted some of the rewards to be more meaningful, it would have made a much more rewarding experience.
On the flip side, I will say that the hunt board was a particularly enjoyable addition with a good variety of challenging encounters and enemy types.
With the transition to a more action-focused combat, I felt that equipment was far less of an importance in Final Fantasy XVI. Outside of accessories, there was rarely any point to purchase or craft weapons or armor, as they would be almost immediately trump what you had received during the main storyline. More often than not, I would craft a new sword, equip it for a mission, and then immediately be rewarded with a new sword on that story mission. This sword would then go on to last me the next 4 or 6 missions and would make anything that would appear in the store redundant. I also had a bit of a giggle on one of the side quests line, crafting the legendary sword in Excalibur, only for it to immediately become obsolete in the very next story mission.
I was also disappointed when visiting a new vendor that they would stock the exact same equipment as the hideout, which made me very rarely have any need to visit these outside the hideout unless I was restocking potions.
Because of this, the crafting mechanic, while a great addition to the series, was very underutilized. There would be very rarely any need to craft new weapons, as they'd already been overpowered by those obtained during the main story. I also found it strange that the same weapon selections were able to be bought or crafted, with only a handful of them being limited crafting only. Because of the abundance of crafting materials in the game, it was very rare that you would opt to purchase a weapon rather than craft it. In stark contrast to this, accessories were very open, allowing you to balance different enhancements and buffs. For my personal playstyle though, I only changed them a handful of times,
as I gravitated towards a particular loadout and stuck with it throughout the game, as a lot of accessories are tied to ability buffs.
I feel with some weapon output tweaking and a more robust crafting system, this could have had the potential to be one of the best in the series. Having more variety between the store's inventory and crafting would have also made the systems feel more meaningful, and I hope that they expand and build on these in future series. Part of the intrigue of the Final Fantasy series was exploring areas, looking in every nook and cranny for chests and hoping that would either have a new weapon or a much needed item or accessory. Despite having big, vast open areas, FF16 doesn't really reward exploration with high value rewards. More often than not, going off the intended path, you are either met with no chests to be discovered, or the ones that do appear just contain common crafting materials.
Uh-huh. Oh, $20. I wanted a peanut.
Because of the high frequency of crafting materials in battles, there is very little advantage to collecting these chests. Some of this problem is more tied to the reward system in the game, that they are plentiful enough not to be high sought after items. More of the rare materials are obtained through hunts rather than explorations. I think it also may be related to the more linear nature of the game, that it is constantly encouraging you to move forward, but even past linear entries in the series still had explorations rewarded with chests for slightly going off the beaten track. By increasing the number of chests or just having the stakes of rewards higher would make this feel like a more satisfying RPG experience. Where were Biggs and Wedge? Biggs and Wedge have consistently made appearances in the Final Fantasy games since the Super Nintendo era. Final Fantasy has always had consistent themes that appear from game to game in Chocobos, Moogles, characters named Sid, Biggs, and Wedge. We were blessed with the formers, but unfortunately Biggs and Wedge were nowhere to be seen. I think an easy win for this would have been to rename Wade and Tyler Biggs and Wedge, or potentially just even having their family names carry on the tradition. Whilst not really plot or gameplay relevant, it was a tradition of the series that I was sad not to see referenced in Final Fantasy XVI.
Wait!
Despite my minor gripes with it, I still believe that Final Fantasy XVI is a brilliant video game, if just a bit light on RPG elements to be classified as one of the higher ranking titles in the Final Fantasy series for me personally. Whilst long-term fans like myself may have issues with these changes and omissions, it may bring a new era of Final Fantasy fans to the series. It will be interesting to see if Square Enix builds up more upon Final Fantasy XVI within DLC, like they did with Final Fantasy XV.
Hi y'all, Future Me here. Since the recording of this video, we excitedly got confirmation from Yoshi P that we had received 2 sets of paid DLC for Final Fantasy XVI. I'm super excited to see what they do with this DLC and how they'll expand on the game like they did with Final Fantasy XV. Back to it.
Or if they continue down the track of it being more action focused in their next mainline title. Were there any changes of mine that you agree with, or are there any changes that you would make to the game to improve it? Let me know down in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to drop a like or subscribe or a comment down below, or you can check me out on some of my other socials. Otherwise, I hope to see you in the next one.